Hi there, it's Kurt McNamara, and I've been working on understanding Bucky Fuller for a few decades now. This video is about the idea of TrimTab, and I've realized it ties into a thing I've now worked on for a few years, what they call a slow hunch, from Stephen Johnson's book, Where Good Ideas Come From. And the slow hunch is that a lot of what Bucky did was about navigation. And he didn't maybe talk about it as clearly as other stuff. And if you're familiar with his life story, obviously there are a lot of actual navigation points, right? As he sailed and he built his own boats and he served in the Navy. So I put this thing together, a whole bunch of slides. I won't go into it now, but I just said, well, what are the basics of navigation, basically? And navigation is not only physical, but metaphysical, with, if you will. And sometimes we call the strategies wayfinding nowadays. And some of these, once again, are metaphysical or cognitive. All right, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in here. I'm not really going to go into it, just to suggest that that's an interesting thing to think about. So then, TrimTab. What's the idea of TrimTab? So you probably know that Bucky really liked the metaphor. In fact, that's on his gravestone, Call Me TrimTab. And often we remember him talking about it as this small lever on the edge of the rudder, kind of a rudder on a big ship like the Queen Mary. And how really, you can't really steer a big ship from the front. You just won't go anywhere. You steer from the rear. And the rudder on a big ship like the Queen Mary is a pretty big object. It's hard to move. And so then the trim tab, this little rudder on the rudder, makes it much easier to move. He really liked that idea because he felt we really needed to move the larger systems. And so finding out ways to be effective trim tabs was going to be very important. So what did he say about it in the Synergetics Dictionary? Well, they said it's a physical environmental control device. Now, it's very clear it can also be metaphysical, if you will. In fact, he gets into that if you kind of page through these things. Excuse me. Interestingly enough, he says you must not just have a theoretical idea, but reduce it to practice. Very clear, one of the ways he worked. So he right away mentions, though, the airplane. And trim tabs are also found in airplanes, both on the rudder, on the tail, as well as on, I think, what they call ailerons on the wings. And they're very important. As he notes here, it would be almost impossible for the plane to fly and control, for the pilot to fly and control the plane without a trim tab to kind of stabilize things and help move it. And so it turns out that there's a secondary function, if you will, in the airplane, which the trim tabs actually sort of hold things in place for the pilot, so it takes a lot less control force. So he has a few other really good things in here. And for example, the child is the trim tab of the future. And now, of course, we're over on the metaphysical somewhat. And now we have the Queen Mary example, if you will. And he mentions flying once again. And then let's talk about you, right? And so then you can trim tab yourself and you can act as a trim tab. And one of the things he says in here is that integrity is really the most important thing. All right, so that's kind of the Bucky background to this. And now I want to show you this card that I put together. So it seems that the trim tab, is really kind of a little lever. And what is a lever? A lever gives you leverage. Aha. That's advantage, right? So if you look at my very poor illustration here, there's the fulcrum on this wavy lever, if you will, which is a channel. And this is your Q down here, right? And you're exerting a small amount of force, whatever kind of force, physical or metaphysical, right? A small amount of force, which is magnified by the fact that the fulcrum is much closer to the system you're trying to change, Mr. and Ms. Infinity up here. So this is not a bad way to think about it. It turns out that for a trim tab to be effective, the point of action, I'm calling it here, needs to be much closer to that system. What does that mean? It means I might have a brilliant idea, but if it doesn't connect well with the system over here, I'm not going to have much leverage. Whereas if the thing I'm talking about does have a great connection to the system over here, I am going to have more leverage. All right, and so then you see here some of the trim tabs. These are on elevators, but they're also on the wings, and I think they're called ailerons. So think about that a little bit, and then really, when you look at the airplane and you think about it, the trim tabs and what I'm going to call the control surfaces. So that's not a too complicated word, but a little bit. So the rudder is a control surface, right? It moves back and forth. As it moves back and forth, it changes, the angle, if you will, the plane is flying at. And then both the elevators on the tail and the ailerons in the ring control the tilt. They control whether it's going up, going down, etc. Very complex motions. So there are control surfaces. Everything I mentioned is a control surface on the airplane to allow the airplane to move in many complicated routes, right? And so then all those are trim tabbable. So this is sort of one of the first things is that if we're looking for trim tabs, we should be aware of control surfaces. So control surfaces allow us to move in whatever space we're in, physical space or metaphysical space, right? And trim tabs then allow us to adjust and help control and stabilize the control surfaces much more easily than if we were just doing it without that advantage. So then one of the things Bucky mentioned is that trim tab works by essentially when it moves, it creates an area with lower pressure. Since this area over here is lower pressure, then the rudder wants to move that way. So the trim tab kind of moves this way, creates lower pressure here, so then the whole rudder moves that way. So the other idea, of course, is the trim tab sort of works the opposite of what you think. So, yeah. So then what are control surfaces and the kind of things that we're interested in? And so then what are we interested in? We might want to change ourselves. Okay, sometimes that's hard to do. We might want to change other people. We might want to change organizations or big systems like fossil fuel. So what we find as we go through and think about it is that we've moved away from the physical ship or the physical airplane. We talked about control surfaces. We're thinking of things that we observe and pay attention to, right? So I may observe and pay attention to my weight or to my sleep or to the various things like my blood pressure. I might do those things. If I have a company, I might pay attention to profit and market share and how the employees are doing and a few other things like that. So those things are all being controlled. So therefore, right, they have control surfaces. So the company controls what it measures is how it works. And there's a great body of literature on how to enlarge your space of measurement and change what you're doing. So basically, it's an observable. Something being controlled is always in a feedback loop. And the feedback loop is never just a single one. So if something is held in a stable state, it's got both positive feedback, increasing it, and negative feedback, decreasing it, if you will. If it was just positive, it would shoot off and crash. And if it was just negative, it would, go inwards and crash. So everything that's being held in a somewhat stable state has both positive and negative feedback loops. So there's another thing, if we look at something being controlled that we'd like to change, we must understand it's being held in place by feedback loops and sort of patterns of expectations. There then are many forces, some of which are visible and many of which, as Bucky said, 99% are invisible to us. So that's a deal. So I already covered where they're found, a little bit about where they could be used, and then just a little bit more here. So how they work, low pressure. Another type of trim tab is phase change, and we won't get into that too much in this lecture. I've got a couple more coming up, but that's kind of an important one. One way to think about it is there's a thing called a motor start capacitor. So it can be pretty hard to start a motor because it could be sort of in the wrong position, if you will. You put some electricity to it, which, creates a field. But if the rotor isn't quite in the right position, then it's pretty hard to build up the current in, I think, what they call a stator. And so it's very hard to get the motor to move. If you add a thing called a capacitor, it kind of changes the phase, and it's much easier to then build up that current, and the motor starts much more easily. And they're everywhere, in all your appliances, everywhere. So that's another generalized principle, as Bucky would say, of phase change. So that's another kind of leverage, and I believe another kind of trim tab. And then catalysts and catalytic things and autocatalytic things. Once again, almost another lecture, but those are very definitely trim tabs. For a trim tab to work, it's got to be accepted, right? If you're imposing something, I would assert it's perhaps Bucky's other idea about how we change the future. We said many times, don't fight the existing system, create a new model. And I think, if we're imposing something, like we're creating a new feedback loop or some of the leverage points, if we start to do that, then I think we're creating a new model. And maybe that seems like a fine point, but I think it's worthwhile when trying to separate trim tabs from other ways to make change. One more thing is that Bucky emphasized, you steer from the rear, right? You can't move the boat from the front, right? You can't drag the front of the airplane around, but on the rear end of it, right, you can make small changes. And so that means that the trim tabs are really kind of an edge effect. And that's pretty interesting. Edge effects show up in permaculture. They show up in what they call boundary objects. They show up all over the place and all the biomimicry. So pretty interesting stuff. Individuals can do it. We talked about that. Alternatives to trim tab, once again, creating a new model, adding connections, I would say, and then valving, almost another lecture as well, but Bucky emphasized that systems valve energy. So we do it, right? We store energy and then we put it out in bursts like I am right now. I'm valving energy and, radiating to you, if you will. And obviously organizations do it, right? And unfortunately, a lot of our valving is from extractive sources, and so it's not sustainable. But valving is a really fundamental thing of all living systems as well, so it's good to think about. And valving relates to leverage points. So I wanted to just talk about that for a minute. Now, the leverage points are typically attributed to Donella or Dana Meadows, and places to intervene in a system are sometimes what they're called. And these come from a study of system dynamics. And so then I'll just do a little bit of a mention of that. I think one way to explore trim tabs is to have a model and to look at how the model is put together and use that as a way to look for ideas. So as an example, if I was interested in regenerative agriculture, and it's like, why isn't it being adopted? I might want to have a model, and that says at an industry level, what's going on with regenerative ag. There's some things holding traditional ag in place, or some things increasing regenerative. There's players, there's forces, there's money, there's impacts on the environment. So I could do that at an industry level, and I could do it at a regional level, and I could do it at a farmer level. And each way that I study it would give me different ideas about trim tabs. A common model, a common way of modeling is called system dynamics, stock and flow modeling, and that's what when Donella Meadows and others talk about systems thinking, they're referring to system dynamics models. So these have stocks, and these are the observable things. Remember that? We talked about if it's being controlled, it's observable. It's something you can measure. You can take a snapshot in time. And so that could be money, it could be resources, or it could be more metaphysical, like motivation. You could take a measurement of my motivation at any instant in time, right? You'd have to use an instrument, right, a psychological instrument to gauge it. But you'd also see my motivation goes up and down. And you could then say, well, what makes it go up and down? And now you start to create a model of Kurt's brain and how motivation is a function of a bunch of different stuff. And this is done. You can find models on all kind of stuff like this. So then, once again, Donella is suggesting that if you have a system dynamics model, you want to change the behavior, which is what it does, then you make a variety of changes in it. So one of the highest level ones is what's the goal of the system in itself. That's a pretty big trim tab, right? And so it turns out, the goal of an organization was started by a group of individuals. It's morphed. There is a mission statement. It's believed. It's kind of baked into the DNA. And it really turns out to be a mix of forces. So if we go back to that idea of what are the forces in the environment, it would be... It's commonly true that there's sort of like economic or job forces upon us, right? things we got to do to pay the rent and do things like that. They're family or relationship forces. Like, oh, but if I stay later at work, I'm going to miss supper. That's a bad thing. So I'm going to make a compromise, right? And then finally, there are the bigger things, which is, boy, oh boy, it'd be great to have a planet that we can live on, in another 10 or 20 years. So there's always an interplay of these forces, and we're sorting out, right, where to negotiate, when to go this way, when to go that way, when to go the next way. So then to make, a big trim tab would be like Interface Carpet, when their founder had a health crisis and decided, you know what, I want to make this carpet company sustainable. That was a huge deal. Ray did an amazing thing. It's a great story to read. So the goal, and she says even higher than that, is the paradigm. Like, why does this company exist would be a thing. So huge things. They could be trim tabbed. And once again, probably to do the kind of thing that most of us want to do, right? We would want to focus more on the core values that an individual had and how it was reflected in the company, and more things about the earth. So we'd want to sort of bring up that awareness, wouldn't we? And maybe to the extent, we'd not compromise or minimize, but we'd sort of balance out the need to just make money, if you will. Other things that we can do in a system dynamics model is that we can adjust tariffs and taxes. So those connections in a system dynamics model, that make a stock go up or down. So back up a second. So a very easy example in a system dynamics model is the level of water in a bathtub, which could be a bank account, right? The switch is the same as the amount of money in a bank account. So you turn on the faucet to increase it. That would be getting wages, getting income. That raises it. And what decreases it? Expenses, things you pay, that sort of thing. So then in a model, you've got a flow going in, right, increasing it, and a flow going out, decreasing it. And there's a positive feedback and a negative feedback, essentially. And when they balance, your bank account stays, above zero, which is a good thing. But if you then think about these flows more generally, you can say, if I put a tariff or a tax on the flow, I'm starting to valve it, aren't I? I'm starting to control it. And so if you make it expensive to do a bad thing, right, then you change the system behavior. Now, that seems less trim tabish to me than creating a new model, but still in all, it's a valid approach. Subsidies are another one. Standards or regulatory would be yet one more that's in that same category of how the flows work and what controls them. System rules, this is, how it's supposed to work, what the company can do, how it operates, things like that. And then system and structure. Now, once again, I'm saying most of these are over towards the other side of Bucky's thinking, which is creating a new model. So adding feedback loops, positive or negative. Adjusting them, I think, is trim tabish, but adding them, I kind of think that's creating a new model. Information flows. Once again, adjusting them, I think, is trim tabish, right? But adding ones, then I think, maybe it's verging towards the model part of the thing. Adding delays or buffers, that's very clearly mean a structural change. That's less trim tabish. And so some of those are new connections, and some of those are sort of new entities. I think it's a good thing to think about it. Why do I do that? Because I think Bucky's intent, if I read all the stuff he's written about it and think about it, it's more subtle, right? Trim tab is more subtle. We're tinkering. We're finding a way, to help somebody kind of re-perceive the bigger system. Like, I educate designers. And if I can give them really good understanding of sustainability and how sustainability ties into core values that their company would have, they can start making changes, trim tabish changes that management may not even be aware of, yet it decreases the impact and increases performance and just basically makes a better company. So there you are, a little longer than I wanted, but kind of an overview of sort of the theory behind trim tabs. And I'll do a second one on applications, if you will, like how to go and do some things I was arm waving about. So take care. Talk to you soon.